The second part of your essay question this week asks you a bit about the legacy of the Crusades on the mindset of people in the West towards the East and of those in the East towards the West. But in order to understand that, you really need to understand what the overall impact of the Crusades were. And so first I would say that they lead to the fall of the Byzantine Empire. This happens when the Ottoman Empire actually conquers the Byzantines, and you see the fall of Constantinople in 1453 under Sultan Mehmed II. The next thing you see is that despite the fact that the Europeans don't really win the Crusades, the Pope does strengthen his position within Europe. He is able to create a common enemy for the people living in the Holy Roman Empire, and people begin to look to him as more of a centralized leader than previously. Another perhaps unexpected result of the Crusades is possibly the growth of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, all the way along the path to Jerusalem, the Crusaders would see these plantations in which the Muslims would have slaves, typically from North Africa, working to produce olives so that they could create olive oil. And they took this idea of these plantations and they brought them to the sugar plantations during the Age of Exploration that existed in the Caribbean, for example. And then later they brought it into the southern United States with the cotton plantation system and the tobacco plantation system. And it's possible that we would have had the transatlantic slave system regardless of whether this had been found out during the Crusades, but I think that you could certainly say that more individuals were trafficked out of Africa as a result of needing them for labor because of this methodology that was learned from Muslims during the Crusades. Another important aspect is the idea of cultural diffusion. If you remember, really Western Europe was in the Dark Ages for most of the Middle Ages, and because of this, there wasn't a whole lot of extensive learning or technological advances. But both China and the Islamic world were at the forefront of advances. And so you see with the Crusades that Islamic scholarship begins to spread throughout Europe. The best example of this is when they recover the library at Toledo. And also, some of the lost classical era research and scholarship begins to actually make its way back out into the light. And the best example of this is that during the Reconquista of Spain, some of the ancient Greek works were found and rediscovered by European scholars who for hundreds of years had really virtually forgotten they existed. And probably the last aspect of cultural diffusion that becomes very important is that Europeans pick up this taste for luxury items from the Islamic world when they're fighting in the Crusades, and they also have a taste for luxury goods from parts of Asia. And this is going to really lead to the Age of Exploration because they're going to desire things like cloves and mace and pepper and spices and cotton from India. And perhaps they'll also look for roots such as rutabaga that they can use for their medicine, and eventually also coffee. And it's going to lead to this expedition of Western Europe into the rest of the world. Another aspect of the impact of the Crusades is the hardening of cultural barriers. While Pope Urban II really hoped that he'd be able to reunite Christianity, you see that there's a solidification of differences between those who identify as Eastern Orthodox Christians and those who identify as Roman Catholics. But even beyond this, there's certainly a hardening between the Christians and the Jews. There's a spread of anti-Semitism that is going to kind of reach a fever pitch in Europe, and it's going to come out and become a part of World War I and certainly part of World War II. And this isn't necessarily the birth of anti-Semitism, but it's really one of the reasons that it spread so rapidly, especially as many of the Jewish people were murdered and often burned at the stake as the Crusaders were heading into and out of Jerusalem. You may have noticed that when I discussed the hardening of cultural barriers, I did not mention the barrier between Muslims and Christians because I think it's unfair to say that the Crusades caused Christians to fear Muslims. They really already viewed them with fear and disdain well before the Crusades ever started. But what the Crusades actually did is that they actually improved Christian and Muslim relations because they increased contact between the Muslims and the Christians so that they didn't seem like such foreign or mythical outsiders. And in fact, Muslim men were often viewed by the Western half of Christendom as romantic and dashing and chivalric warriors, and Muslim women were either viewed as beautiful and intelligent and resourceful, or as beautiful and cunning and resourceful. But there was in some way a respect for who they were as people. Muslims, for their part, certainly admired Christian warriors. They thought that they were incredibly courageous, and they admired the fact that they were willing to defend their faith. But they did see them as rash and uncultured in the same way that the Christians saw the Muslims as barbarians. And they also thought that Christian women were a little bit too loose, that they freely allowed strange men into their company. And so they didn't necessarily understand the culture of the opposing side, but at least they had been further exposed to it, so that over time there could become a greater understanding of one another. At the end of this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the gunpowder empires that emerged following the end of the Crusades, but it's safe to say that the Muslim world really expands because of their victory in the Crusades between the 15th and 17th centuries. And ultimately, this actually leads Western Europeans to start the age of exploration or the age of discovery, because the Europeans have that taste for luxury goods from Asia, but in order to get those goods, they have to travel through Islamic territory. And in fact, the papacy threatened merchants who traded with Muslims with excommunication for trading with their enemy. So rather than being able to go across the land routes or the sea routes that would utilize territory owned by the Muslims, they needed to find a way to go across the Atlantic Ocean and come along the backside and enter into China and India that way. And a lot of European empire building in the New World is seen as an extension of the Crusades. It's still got the same motivation of God wills it. When Columbus, for example, writes that he hopes to reach Jerusalem by sailing west instead of traveling east, because that route is closed by the Muslims, he realizes eventually that this is impractical and he's not going to be successful. And so he looks at the Americas and Hispaniola when he discovers it, and he believes that it's a new opportunity that has been sent to him directly by God in order to compensate the faithful, him and his men, for the loss of the Holy Land of Jerusalem during the Crusades. Another example of how this is an extension of the Crusades is that during the Crusades there was a military religious order. It was called the Order of Christ, and it was set up in 1319 by the King of Portugal. And the whole point of it was to continue the war against the Muslims in Spain. However, you see that when the Crusades end, they actually end up playing a really large role in the mission work that goes on in the Portuguese exploration of the Americas. And a great deal of the missionaries, the Dominican and the Jesuit missionaries who come to the New World, see themselves as following the mandates of Pope Urban II, as bringing a civilizing impulse of Christianity to barbaric people. And they compare Native Americans and indigenous people in many ways to the Muslims at the start of the Crusades. The Crusades also have a strong impact on art and culture and literacy in that they lead, because of the creation of the gunpowder empires, to this flowering of Islamic art, culture, literacy, and education. It's known as the second flowering of Islam. But they also cause a lot of Europeans to flee Italy when the Muslim forces began advancing on that portion of Europe. And this is really the impetus for the start of the Renaissance, because many of the incredibly wealthy people who fled to Italy began to patronize painters and sculptors and artists, people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And essentially, this brings us into the modern era of the concept of humanism and rationalism, the idea of using reason and the scientific revolution and the search for empirical evidence rather than a basis of superstition or religious dogma. And it also brings us to a resurgence of a modern age of democracy in the form of the Enlightenment and the ideals that are brought to fruition through the Atlantic revolutions. Now, I'm not saying that had the Crusades never happened, that this also wouldn't have happened, but that the Crusades were certainly essential in causing this beginning of this sort of shift from ancient history to modern history, and that it may have happened differently in a different place or at a different time without the help of the Crusades. While the Christians aren't successful in winning the Crusades do show that the Christians and the European world is moving out of the Dark Ages. They show that they're able to finance and mobilize a large army through a very well-staffed and organized bureaucracy. And the Crusades actually encouraged the development of taxation in order to finance the Crusades, which still has a major impact on European lives, as this taxation system remained in place well after the end of the Crusades, for better or for worse. In my opinion, one of the most important impacts of the Crusades is that of the Protestant Reformation. Remember that Pope Urban II had guaranteed plenary indulgences for fighting in the Crusades. And it was this direct cause that led Martin Luther to protest the Catholic Church when he went to the door of the church in Wittenberg and tacked up his 95 Theses. And these 95 Theses included a full list of all the problems he had with the Catholic Church. He certainly mentioned corruption of the church, the fact that the church was often dealing with money more than it was dealing with helping people. He mentioned sexual corruption, the fact that often the clergy had sexual relationships. Some of them were secretly married, for example, or visited brothels. He discussed the ritualistic nature of Catholicism, but up at the very top of that list was what he saw as the selling of salvation. And he also pointed out the fact that he did not believe the church should be organizing armed warfare. He said that this was the responsibility of secular princes. This was the realm of politics, not of the church. And I think what happens next is really a good example of the kind of issue that can emerge when the papacy and the leader of an empire or of a country don't get along. Because this Protestant Reformation and this agitation for reform was already building, King Henry VIII in England, who is incredibly famous, decides to take advantage of this religious dissent. He had been married for quite some time to a woman named Catherine of Aragon, and they even had a daughter together named Mary. But at this point, he met a woman named Anne Boleyn. And despite having slept with her sister, and possibly having slept with her mother as well, he decided that he wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. And in the Catholic Church, it simply is not possible to get a divorce at this time. You can get an annulment, however. And according to Henry, he began to accuse Catherine, who had married his brother first, of having consummated that relationship. Now, the truth of the story is, Catherine probably never had intercourse with his brother. His brother was incredibly sick, and they were married for a very short period of time before he died, and Henry knew all about this marriage before he ever married Catherine. So it was certainly just a plea to get Catherine to leave and go join a convent and allow him to remarry. For her part, Catherine was a staunch Catholic, and she refused to acknowledge this. She said that she refused to lie so that he could get a divorce. So Henry VIII sends out a messenger to the Pope, and he asks for permission to get an annulment. And in the Catholic Church, if you've never had any kind of sexual relationship, an annulment can be possible. But of course, the Pope sends out a decree, and he says in his dispensation that he will not grant King Henry a divorce from his wife, that he does not believe that she was impure or that they're related in any way other than as husband and wife. And so Henry VIII decides that he is actually going to jump on this bandwagon of Protestant reform, and he is going to change the entire religion of England to Protestantism, or Anglicanism to be more specific. When this happens, he no longer has to have the Pope's authority or permission in order to get a divorce. And he divorces Catherine, he banishes her, and he marries Anne Boleyn. And probably at some point you've heard the story before where he goes on and he successively marries 5 different women. Some of them die in childbirth. Some, like Anne Boleyn, are eventually beheaded. Anne was actually accused of being a witch and accused of sleeping with her brother at one point before he beheaded her. And so the story of Henry VIII is incredibly sordid, and it's full of a lot of juicy details. And there was a movie that came out called The Other Boleyn Girl that's based on a book by Philippa Gregory, if you're interested in this topic. And also Netflix has the series The Tudors available, which follows the life of Henry VIII, in particular his marriage to his first wife and all of his succeeding wives. And it's a very good series. So what I would say about the Protestant Reformation is that although the Great Schism in 1054 started the fracturing of Christianity, the Crusades and the selling of plenary indulgences really lead to this Reformation, which further begins to fracture Christianity, and you'll see that it fractures even further in splinters between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, and then from Roman Catholic to the Protestants. And then beneath that, you'll begin to see it fracturing out even further into Puritans and Pilgrims and Methodists and Lutherans. And it's the reason why when you walk down a street in the Bible Belt today, you'll see a huge variety of different churches to choose from, because there are periodically these fragmentations of Christianity, this being one of the most important. So the last part of the essay you're working on this week asks you about the legacy of the Crusades today in the mindset of the people in both the West as well as the Middle East. And if you look at the time period directly after the Crusades, for almost a millennium after the Crusades ended, nobody in either area really cared much about them. The Christians were pretty wrapped up in the Greek and Roman past, and Muslims, if they thought about foreign invaders, were probably more likely to think about the trauma of when the Mongols actually invaded their territory. This doesn't change until the 19th century, and this changes because of the rise of nationalism. You start finding there are these patriotic historians who go in and rediscover the Crusades, and they use these as heroic examples of French and British and German chivalry and martial valor. And sometimes they'll twist the story of the Crusades to back up the propagandic piece they're writing. It really flourishes during World War I, when medieval legends offered this romantic alternative to a very grim war with trench warfare, and the early aviators became the knights of the air. And you'll see on some of those early World War I planes, they've got the same crosses emblazoned across them that you would see on the Crusaders' uniforms. It helps certainly that the Crusades are among the few times that the British and the French actually fought on the same side rather than against one another, because once again, with the world wars, you see this happening. Because Christians identified with the Crusaders in the years following the Crusades, the opponents of the Christians, like the Ottomans during World War I, naturally identified with Muslim leaders like Saladin, the commander who had famously recaptured Jerusalem. The Crusaders served then, as well as today, as a metaphor for enemies to better articulate the hatred of the people. Post-World War I, Crusader-themed nationalism proved popular with Europe's fascist right, which is part of the reason it loses its luster in the West, especially when Hitler and the Nazi Party begins to pick up the guise of the crusading trend. Now, the Crusades rhetoric also remained popular in association with Israel, and there's really a sad irony to the fact that Zionists identify as crusaders. The first real issue with this, of course, is that the Crusades were an unmitigated disaster for the Jewish people, as they were killed by the Crusaders. A lot of Zionist leaders were convinced in turn of the 20th century Europe that they could never really belong as part of the European countries that were full of right-wing anti-Semitic nationalists who enjoyed romanticizing a bunch of medieval knights who killed both Jews and Muslims. So it seems a little bit strange that the Zionists would then identify with the cause of the Crusaders. But what they most identified with was the notion that Jerusalem was their holy land and that they were willing to fight to protect that land. There are certainly some even greater ironies about how the Crusades are remembered today because of the writings of those 19th century historians. We have to keep in mind that the main protagonist of the Crusades were barbarians from the edges of both the Christian and the Muslim worlds, and they did not originally identify with either religion. They belatedly embraced their faith with this excessive zeal in order to fit into the civilizations that they had only very recently conquered. And you can view this instead as a conflict between the Seljuk Turks and the Normans, and it becomes sort of a parable for this era. The Normans, who are not really claimed by any present-day nation, are essentially Vikings who settled in northern France, or called Normandy in the 10th century, and when they're there, they convert to Christianity, they learn French, and then they conquer England, Ireland, Sicily, and set off on the Crusades in the Middle East. The Seljuks, if you remember, are originally these ruthless mercenaries who seize control of Baghdad and take over the Abbasid Caliphate. They are not necessarily Muslim at the beginning, but they end up converting. So in reality, both of the instigators of the Crusades were far from pious, and they're not necessarily always remembered correctly when people discuss the Crusades. They were definitely eager to compensate for their lack of pious credentials, and that explains why they ended up as the protagonists in this epic religious war. The Norman Christians accepted Christianity nominally at first, and this was their stipulation that if they settled in northern France, they needed to become Christians. So they began to patronize churches and monasteries, and it became a crucial method of gaining acceptance as a respectable part of this new society. In the words of one abbot, the Crusaders were, quote, more apt to destroy than to build the temples of the Lord. And we know that this can be true when we look back and think about the crusade in which the Crusaders came in and actually sacked Constantinople because they were bribed by Pope Alexius III, who disliked the emperor who had been put on the throne in Constantinople. They took all the wealth they could find, they killed and raped Christians as they went, they stole the statues of horses that now adorn St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, and they retook exactly none of the Holy Land, instead hurting the greatest city in Eastern Christendom. And this didn't just happen once. There was constant fighting between the Christians of the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe. But today, we've rewritten this as a holy war, and we see it in shades of black and white. The civilized and the religious, the Christians, versus the barbaric people of the wrong faith, the Muslims. On the other hand, you have the Muslims, and they sound an awful lot like the story of the Normans. They move into the Abbasid dynasty, and they began to convert to Islam. And as they do, they take over, but they take over without any descent at all to the Prophet Muhammad. They certainly are not elected by the Ummah or the community of believers within the Islamic world. And so they reinvent themselves as the defenders of the Sunni faith, and yet they are pretty much standing opposite of everything that either the Sunni or the Shia believe in, and this proves problematic throughout the Crusades. One envoy actually described the vices of the Turks as including, quote, the shamelessness of their women, who were always unveiled and brazenly exposing their privates, the general aversion to water and washing, and the fact that men never took off their garments, which became encrusted with dirt until they frayed away and disintegrated. So just like the Christians, there wasn't necessarily a pious kind of behavior that began these crusades, and yet this is very much how they're remembered by both sides. Absolutely, some of the crusaders who fought were hypocrites, but I think there was a large majority who were simple men that were convinced by their own religious rhetoric or that of the Pope or that of their holy leader that they were doing the right thing. And you find this on both the side of the Muslims as well as the Christians. But what has happened is historians have taken a very complex war in which you see Muslims fighting Christians and Christians fighting Jews and Christians fighting other Christians, and they've distilled it into this very simplistic narrative. It becomes this holy war between the West on one side and the Christian forces, and the East on the other side with the despotic Muslim forces. And we use it as a way to back up the way in which we see the world, to back up our own rhetoric that the West represents freedom and the East represents unfreedom. And so what you're doing this week with your discussion board is that you're going to read a couple of documents and watch a little clip or two. And on the one hand, and you'll learn about the conflict in Palestine, between Palestine and Israel, and the fact that the Jews and the Muslims are still fighting over the same Holy Land as they were during the Crusades. You're also going to learn a little bit about Islamophobia. What kind of beliefs is it that people today have about Muslims in the United States? What kind of discrimination exists against Muslims in the United States? And it's going to hopefully put together for you, piece together this idea of why it's so easy for us to look at the Crusades as a war that was just over religion, as a holy war, and not to think about the fact that it was a war over land and territory and natural resources and wealth and power and prestige, and that it was a war that pitted Christian against Muslim and Christian against Jew and even Christian against Christian, and that this very simplistic narrative that's been written by historians is in fact false. And that it is the same as when you take a history class in the United States and you learn only good things about our founding fathers or only good things about important events in American history. It's learning about Christopher Columbus and being taught that he discovered America and that he is a wonderful conquistador instead of being taught that he was a rapist who fed Native American babies to his dogs. And so what I hope that you get from this discussion of the Crusades and of what happened between the Middle East and Western Europe and Eastern Europe is that this isn't a story of black and white. It's a story with lots of different shades of color, and that you cannot trust just one historical source. You have to get the entire picture to fully understand the event and to understand why certain groups have co-opted this event and attempted to use it to their own benefit over time. So the very last thing that I just want to quickly talk about are the gunpowder empires. And these are the empires that form when the Islamic world expands after the Crusades between the 15th and 17th centuries. And they include the Safavid Empire, which is located in Persia, the Mughal Empire, which is located in India, and the Ottoman Empire, which is located in the former Byzantine Empire. And you all will learn a little bit more about them next week when we do the Age of Exploration. But in general, these empires are formed by outside conquerors who go in and they unify these regions based on their mastery of firearms. They develop a centralized administration, which allows them to mobilize their financial power, their manpower, and their natural resources in order to purchase gunpowder, which is quite expensive, and then they can supervise the deployment of their arms and the training of their military. Gunpowder is actually first used in China in the 10th century, and it's used by the Ming dynasty and their artillery when they fight the Mongols. Eventually, the Mongols pick up this technology, and when they go and attack the Middle East picks it up, and slowly it diffuses into Europe during the Crusades. Now, firearms and a lot of weapons made out of gunpowder were very expensive and very complex in this time period, so only the wealthiest states were going to be able to afford them. They would trade in these weapons in order to form a monopoly of centralized states, who would then use this advanced weaponry to go out and conquer all of the surrounding territory. And the Islamic world is really at the center of the trade networks and learning as a result of this. So we're going to see that there is going to be a second flowering of Islam. And one of the great impacts of the Crusades is that the learning of many of these Islamic scholars is going to spread, as well as their culture, throughout vast regions of Europe and Asia and Africa and portions of the Middle East even further. And that as we move into the age of exploration, while Western Europeans are going to focus on the New World, the Old World up until World War I is really going to be dominated by the Ottoman Empire and by these gunpowder empires.
The Crusades, stretching from the late 11th to the late 15th century, were far more than isolated wars of religion. They reflected the deep interconnection of faith, politics, and society in the medieval world. Pope Urban II's call at Clermont unleashed not only armies of knights but also waves of ordinary peasants, driven by devotion, desperation, and the hope of redemption. The Byzantine plea for help, the Seljuk push into the eastern Mediterranean, and Europe's growing strength all converged to ignite centuries of conflict. Although the Crusaders seized Jerusalem briefly, they ultimately failed to establish lasting control over the Holy Land. The later Crusades dwindled in strength and coherence, with many collapsing into disasters or being redirected against fellow Christians, as in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Yet, even in failure, the Crusades transformed Europe and the Middle East. They deepened mistrust between Christianity and Islam, widened the rift between Eastern and Western Christendom, and altered the balance of power across the Mediterranean. At the same time, the Crusades stimulated trade, cultural exchange, and curiosity. Contact with the Islamic world brought Europeans new ideas, technologies, and goods, from Arabic numerals to spices and silk, that helped lay the groundwork for Europe's later Renaissance and global expansion. In this way, the Crusades left behind a paradoxical legacy, remembered as wars of faith and violence, yet also as catalysts of profound transformation. As we look back on these centuries of conflict, we can see the Crusades as both a product of their medieval world and a turning point that shaped the course of global history, echoing into the modern era in the complex relationships between the West and the Middle East.